Welcome to the Emily Rassam Show, the podcast that proves parenting, business, and home life can all be juggled, just not always gracefully. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share because laughter and maybe chaos is better when it's spread around. Welcome to the Emily Rassam Show. I am your host, Emily. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share my show. And today I am joined by Andrew O'Shaughnessy of the University of Virginia. And fun fact, he has worked at Monticello or with Monticello for over 20 years. Today we will be speaking history, and I would first like to give a shout out for his latest book, Republican Empire, Crisis, Revolution, and America's Early Independence. What was your inspiration for writing Republican Empire? And I love that you have also focused a lot on history as done via the British Empire instead of just from American perspective, which is something we don't hear a lot in America. Can you tell us a little bit about your new book, Republican Empire, first of all, and then I will ask you some questions from there.
So this is a co-authored book with the late Trevor Burnard, who was head of history at Warwick University in later Melbourne, and also head of the Wilberforce Institute for Slavery and Emancipation at Hull University. And I like to joke that it's Hamlet without the prince. It's essentially about the American Revolution without talking about the usual stories of the American Revolution and what was going on internally in America. It instead looks at the American Revolution from the perspective of all the colonies that did not rebel, the rest of the British Empire. And my first book is really the origins of this book. It was called An Empire Divided, the American Revolution and British Caribbean. And in it, I make the comment that we could actually learn a lot about the revolution by looking at what happened in the Caribbean and why they didn't rebel and using it as a comparative case. So this is really an expansion of my very first book. There are several major takeaways. One, it's much easier to understand British policy before the American Revolution by looking at policy throughout the rest of the empire. We can see a much more coherent series of initiatives aimed at centralizing the empire, a more direct government from England, increasing revenue from the empire, and improving the defenses of the empire. And one of the takeaways of that is that for many years people have suggested, including the very first half of the 20th century, that there were very little grounds for the American Revolution. It was merely about a tax that was tiny, the tea tax. And the case that we make is that there really was a major change taking place in British policy, and there were real grounds for rebellion. Admittedly, the threat of tyranny was more latent than immediate, but if the British had been able to establish a precedent for raising taxes, they could have introduced so many more. The other takeaway is that the British are really focusing primarily on America. So we see these policies throughout the empire, but they separated America for particular punishment and were much more concerned about America. Another feature of the book is that we look at how we can prioritize the causes of the American Revolution and the various debates about the American Revolution by looking at colonies which were very similar to the American colonies. They had assemblies or some kind of representative government. They had similar political ideas, but they don't rebel. And these primarily are the British Caribbean, Bermuda, Nova Scotia, and also Ireland. And, questions like, was slavery important as a cause of the American Revolution? We can really debate that by looking at places which had slavery but which didn't rebel. The third big takeaway for military historians among your audience is that you can much better understand why the British lost the American Revolution by looking at this war as an imperial war in which Britain was fighting counterinsurgency war in America, but it was ultimately also fighting France from 1778, Spain from 1779, and Holland, the Dutch Republic, from the beginning of 1781, as well as the Maratha Kingdom in India. The very last battle of the American Revolution was fought in India, and the battles there were much larger. It also means that we take more seriously naval history and realize how important the various navies, especially the French Navy, were in the American victory. And I'm even able to isolate some of the reasons why in these counterinsurgency wars, like Vietnam and Afghanistan, the Davids defeat the Goliaths, and what are the conditions really necessary for a small country like Ukraine to be able to defeat a much larger country like Russia, so it has some contemporary relevance. We look at quite a bit of social history, slavery, native groups, settler colonization, and my co-writer was an authority on the slave trade and slavery, and he always points out how central that was to the British Empire, both before but also after the American Revolution. Some people slightly glamorize the British as these emancipationists who freed slaves who came over to their side, but we remind people they had 100,000 slaves of their own in the British Caribbean and some elsewhere in the empire. And finally, we look at the impact of the American Revolution on the British Empire and the British Empire on the American Revolution post-1783, and it's a lot of fun connections, such as the founding of Australia. The British started, through Captain Cook, exploring what is now New South Wales during the American Revolution, and afterwards they were presented with a problem what to do with their prisoners who they'd previously been sending to Georgia primarily, and who were being kept in what are known as prison hulks. These are old ships along the River Thames which were being used as prisons, and the solution was to send them to New South Wales, and hence the beginning of the famous convict trade. And there are a lot of other interconnections. People like Thomas Jefferson were really worried that the British still wanted to treat America as a part of its empire, and that you'd have what people today call neo-colonialism, that they wouldn't be truly independent, they'd be dominated by the British. One of the reasons Jefferson so hated Hamilton was that Hamilton saw the British relationship, along with John Adams, as a good thing and wanted to copy many of the features of the British government that had made it such a formidable power, like national debts and national banks. And Jefferson feared that America would live permanently under the shadow of Britain.
Yes, and so I have a lot of audience that may not be very familiar with history at all. And one of the things I would like you to give us or expand upon is that, yes, the U.S., or what became the U.S., had 13 colonies, but there were 13 additional colonies in the islands surrounding us, and they, as you said, did not participate in the Revolutionary War. Could you tell us a little bit about this and what they were trading amongst each other? And I remember seeing a little excerpt from your book talking about how, it may have been your book, that we were growing tobacco here in the U.S. and decided to switch over to crops that we had been bringing in from Europe.
Yeah, like corn.
Yes, like corn.
So the other colonies included places like Jamaica and Barbados in the British Caribbean and Antigua, but they also included East and West Florida, which at this time was under Spanish control. And they also included what is now Canada, a place like Quebec and Montreal and Nova Scotia and Bermuda. So there are actually 26 colonies in the Americas and many more in the outside world. We've mentioned India and Ireland, but there were places like Gibraltar, the Jersey Islands, all of which were governed by Britain. even before the American Revolution, Sir George Macartney had coined the phrase, the empire upon which the sun never set. And the empire actually grew after the American Revolution, so that by the time George III died, which wasn't until 1820, he outlived the great majority of American revolutionaries. And in the last 10 years of his life, he had to step down, abdicate in favor of his successor, who was known as the Prince Regent. But by the time George III died, the empire consisted of a fifth of the global population, and the largest area was Bengal in India, and they continued to expand. Charles Cornwallis, who'd been defeated by the Americans at Yorktown, he later went on to expand the British Empire in the southern parts of India.
And then I would like to reference your other book now in a question, The Men Who Lost America. And I know that you spoke about challenging the myth of incompetence when it came to the British soldiers. And one of the arguments I have seen regularly is that really the rebels of the US Army wore them down because they knew they didn't have many replacements. Can you tell us a little bit about the myth of the British incompetence or the incompetence with the military? Because we do know for a fact that George Washington lost a lot of battles.
So this is a popular idea. I've always thought it doesn't reflect that well on Americans, and just the success of their victory by saying it was just bad, incompetent British officers. This is a popular theme in movies. The Patriot, for example, shows Cornwallis more concerned with getting a better uniform, and he calls his uniform a horse blanket. I mean, it's a splendid scarlet uniform that he's wearing, than getting supplies for his army. The real Cornwallis was someone who was without very much pretension, although he had an aristocratic background, who dumped all his belongings, including the rum rations of his army, at Rams's Mill in North Carolina, and essentially lived like what his commander called a Tartar army, really suggesting that they were almost like savages, and slept out in the open with his troops. Most of these commanders had been in the army since their early teens. They were real professionals and very committed, and the British sent over really their best and brightest. William Howe, who was the commander after Bunker Hill, he was chosen over 106 more senior generals precisely because he'd fought in America and he understood what the British called Indian warfare. This is less conventional tactics with riflemen and people firing from behind trees and bushes rather than traditional pitched warfare. Americans have actually often made fun of this idea of the British incompetence. So there was a comedy called Sweet Liberty that in I think it was the late 70s or 80s, in which the British reenactors are told to look stupid and they rebel and get very angry and decide they're going to win the war in the movie, which utterly upsets the movie. And my point is not that all the judgments and calls were right, but that this idea that it was lost by poor generals deflects from the real reasons for the loss. But it's often the case in warfare that we blame individuals.
Yes.
And whereas sociologists have a phrase of people being set up to fail, not having the equipment and the needs. And I think the reasons they failed are vastly more complex, that they had an army of conquest. They took every major city in America, but not an army large enough for occupation. So they had to import all their food supplies, or most of them, even candles and wood, 3,000 miles, which was an incredible feat. No country had ever undertaken such a thing before. They didn't mobilize fully at the beginning of the war because they were worried about provoking the French to become American allies. which was something they naturally wanted to avoid. And they were hamstrung in many ways. But what I really point out is this counterinsurgency warfare, in which often the big power isn't really defeated in the true sense of the term. America could have continued the war in Vietnam. America could have continued the war in Afghanistan. What changes is the support for the war. People get worn down. They start to question the cost of the war. And the leaders start to reevaluate whether this is really so worthwhile. And there's also a perception there's really no exit plan. And by the time of Yorktown, most people realized that the British were getting nowhere. The whole war effort had been predicated on the idea that the majority of Americans supported Britain. But that was obviously shown to be untrue as they entered each state, but got surprisingly little support, especially as the war continued. The very presence of the British Army, along with their Native American allies and German mercenaries, alienated the local population. A lot of people became more strident in their support of the Patriots. And Washington was a brilliant tactician. I've been writing a series about him in the Washington Post. He took a lot of incredible risks. There were times when his army came very close to capture, like the Battle of Brooklyn, but he also practiced what are known as Fabian tactics, in which a lot of the time he played for time and essentially didn't expose his army. There were exceptions, and certainly he was very keen on defeating the British by conventional military battles, but he could replace troops. Although with difficulty, they actually had to conscript troops into the Continental Army, whereas the British, after about, really after 1776, had very few new reinforcements. And once France came into the war, that really moved the main location of the war to the Caribbean. And the British were sending more troops and more ships to the Caribbean than to North America. I feel very sorry for the commanders in the second half of the war, namely Sir Henry Clinton and Cornwallis, because they were expected to win with a smaller army and with less naval support. The help of the French was critical because the French provided money, and the American Revolution in many stages was virtually bankrupt. Congress had no power to formally tax. It could simply request gifts from the different states, but they were often more concerned with defending themselves and with supplying their own militia. And then the French Navy, the role of that was huge because it meant that they were able to take on the British Navy throughout the world, and it also meant that they were able to support the American Army. And the British commander, Sir Henry Clinton, recognized that the British could have been defeated earlier in the war with better coordination between the Continental Army and the French. But the ultimate defeat at Yorktown was a combination of the French Navy and French Army and the American Army that isolated not the main British Army, but a detachment under Lord Cornwallis, a major detachment, and forced his surrender. It's often been pointed out that there were more French seamen and army officers and soldiers than Americans at the Battle of Yorktown, that they really did play a critical role.
And these are some things we don't typically speak about in American history class and in undergraduate or through grade school. And what I got very excited to speak with you about is because I have read so many children's books to my little ones now, and they're completely historically inaccurate. And could you give us a couple examples of historical inaccuracies when it comes to this whole series of events that you have heard over and over again? I know one that comes to mind right away is George Washington chopping down a cherry tree. And I hear that that was fabricated after his death, this story, because they didn't have a lot of information on Washington's childhood.
That's right. So there's a lot of mythology
Yes.
like that. And we tend not to talk about his early defeats. He managed to turn his service in the French and Indian War into a success story. But in reality, he'd been captured with his army and had made some bad decisions. The great thing about Washington is his ability to grow and his ability to bounce back from adversity. And I think that's a much better story than this sort of alabaster figure who had got it always right. So he was often in retreat. Every major battle, direct battle with Sir William Howe, he was defeated, and these were some of the biggest battles of the American Revolution. And yet he kept his army together. He kept improving the quality of his army and the training. And by the end of the war, the British themselves were amazed that this citizen army was as good as virtually any professional army in Europe. And this, to me, is a much better story of someone who could constantly bounce back, who's
Yes.
incredibly resourceful, although maybe the greatest story of Washington was as a politician, not only in preventing a mutiny in the army and keeping good relations with Congress, it was a real diplomat, but in resigning from the army at the end of the war. I was once asked by a student from Africa who was part of a special program of young African leaders, why did the American Revolution, why did the Constitution succeed when it's failed in so many other revolutions, when most revolutions become civil wars? And I gave my pat answer. I said they were very sensible. Unlike the European Union and Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they held a special convention that would write the Constitution instead of having it written by the people already in power who would write themselves a blank check. And the student came back to me and said, well, we did that in our country and there was a military coup. And then it suddenly clicked to me how important it was that Washington decided to stand down. And obviously he played a crucial role in getting the Constitution passed. Everybody knew he'd be the first president, and in giving dignity to the new government of the Republic. He really was the indispensable man of the American Revolution. In my Washington Post article, I talk about all the alternatives to Washington who were proposed. There were several schemes against him by officers who felt that he was not up to the task. And in each case, like Horatio Gates, the great victor of Saratoga, these people had disastrous military records ultimately, and certainly could not have worked so well with Congress.
And also, I was wondering if you could give us some insight into Washington's cabinet, because I hear it was extremely diverse with people in all different viewpoints. And how do you think that he got them all to work together so well?
So, I mean, the revolution was very idealistic. It was like the 60s. People thought there would be peace and that everyone would put aside their differences and work together. And the whole idea was not to have political parties, which today we see as part of the functioning of a successful representative system. And so Washington tried to create a cabinet that combined all the various political viewpoints of the major leaders. And so it included John Adams as vice president. It included Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and it included Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. Of course, it didn't work out. The politics became polarized. You have the formation of the Federalist Party, people like Hamilton and Adams, and what becomes the Republican Party, or they're sometimes called the Jeffersonians, who supported Thomas Jefferson. The country was more polarized than now, to the point that during the election of 1800, the governors of Virginia and Pennsylvania armed their militia expecting war. And the rhetoric and political infighting and the kinds of comments made by the press and the false information were very much beyond what we now have. It was even claimed during the election that Jefferson was dead.
I didn't hear that one. That's pretty bad.
His opponents called him an atheist, which he found particularly wounding because he believed in the idea of a creator. He even seems to have accepted the notion that there might be an afterlife, and he was struggling with his own religious beliefs. He did reject traditional Christianity and the Trinity and the miracle stories of the New Testament. He even wrote what is sometimes called the Jefferson Bible, in which he cut and pasted 5 copies of the New Testament, and he did this in 4 different languages, and he basically made it the life and sayings of Jesus, that saw Jesus as a great social theorist, and but removed everything that he felt had been added by later generations. He wanted to get back to what he thought was the reality of early Christianity.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned Jefferson now. Can you give us a little bit of Jefferson's history? Because I know from studying history in school, as an example, since most of my listeners will not have a deep, in-depth understanding of this time period, that he started out with not a lot to his name and his family name, and his father passed away when he was very young. So how did he go from almost nothing to where he ended up as president of the United States, and then when he formed the University of Virginia?
So he did inherit quite a bit of land, and his mother was part of the famous Randolph family of Virginia, who were almost like aristocrats. So, I mean, just by birth, like Washington, he was a major and one of the wealthier people in Virginia. But unlike most of his school and college contemporaries, he really developed a reading habit at a very young age, and was fortunate too in having some excellent tutors. He always said later on he was very lucky to come under the influence of very positive figures. He said, otherwise I might have become like my contemporaries and gone drinking, gambling, and womanizing. And he established himself as a really good mind and then became a lawyer. He became involved in the revolutionary movement quite late, and he essentially started to go to meetings at the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, where he met Washington, and they discussed ways to oppose Britain. But what really established him was writing a pamphlet about the rights and wrongs of the whole conflict, as summary review. And he published that in 1774, and it was because of that John Adams and the rest of the committee of the Declaration of Independence chose him to write the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. It was many years before people knew he'd written it, the main body of the text. He did become governor of Virginia during the Revolutionary War, which was one of the most important states along with Massachusetts. And then, of course, after that, he was ambassador to France, and then he came back to be Secretary of State under the Washington presidency. During John Adams' presidency, he was vice president. But that's when he really started to form an opposition party and to plan his own campaign to run to become president. And of course, he had 2 terms in office. On the tombstone, he wanted his epitaph to be Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which is really the statute that has most influenced the way we interpret the First Amendment on the separation of church and state, and father of the University of Virginia, which was the topic of my previous book, and was an incredible achievement. It was done between the ages of 73 and 83, and I cannot think, and this is why we can't just discard Jefferson, despite the fact that his reputation is sullied by slavery, because I can't think of any other head of state who's spent so long conceiving a university, designing it, founding it, and they're micromanaging every aspect of the university. And that was just the apex of his educational vision. He wanted to have a public system of education which included women. He proposed that during the American Revolution when Virginia was threatened with being invaded, and it would have been the first public school system in the world if he had succeeded. So this man was a visionary in a lot of ways. And what I say to people about the founders now, who often don't live up to our own standards in terms of their views and may look very outdated, that Jefferson himself knew that would happen. He said, we will one day be considered like our witch-burning grandparents, which reminds you how close the Salem witchcraft trials were to Jefferson's time. And he said that's good, because if people use their reason and use evidence to progress, they should look back at the past as backward and faulted, and they should be improving the past. And so I always argue with the founders that they gave this country a blueprint with which to continue to build. And in that sense, the American Revolution is still in progress as you move, hopefully, towards a more perfect union and to right the wrongs of the past and always be making it a better country.
Yes, and what is your take on this? Because I teach my children this all the time, that we can't rewrite history. We learn from all of the dumb things that have been tried already. And yes, improve upon it. And that's exactly what Thomas Jefferson referenced as well. And so that was why it was important for me to speak with you about the Revolutionary War and all of the people that we keep hearing in the news and all the crazy things that they may or may have not done. And we need to do our homework on it and get a full understanding, because I know personally myself, I make mistakes all the time too. We have to allow mistakes to be made. And I wanted to briefly remind everyone that Thomas Jefferson wanted to start public education, which was a novel idea in his day. And can you please tell us a little bit about how he worked on the University of Virginia and his time there and what all he was involved in? Because he really was a Renaissance man.
So he was involved in every aspect. As an architect, he designed the university, admittedly with some help from really good architects like William Thornton and Benjamin Latrobe, but the basic plan was his, and he wanted to make it a village of buildings and a real community, rather than having one big building like Yale, Harvard, and Princeton and Hampden-Sydney and most universities at the time. If Jefferson were known as nothing else, he'd be known as one of the greatest architects, the greatest architect in America in the 18th century, other than these professional European architects like Thornton and Latrobe. He designed the syllabus. He wanted science to be taught, which was quite radical at the time, to introduce really the first program of teaching economics. But he wasn't a STEM guy, because he also believed in the importance of teaching Anglo-Saxon. And he was novel in that he didn't feel classics should be required, but he thought it was a very good education and loved reading the classics himself. He had lots of creative ideas for student self-governance, faculty self-governance. He chose the faculty on the basis of ability and merit long before Johns Hopkins was founded and made that part of its mantra. He had a medical school and a law school and a lot of interest in medicine and the way that it should be practiced. As a heart surgeon at the university who's recently done a book on Jefferson medicine and the University of Virginia, which shows really how impressive his ideas were and how for a while the University of Virginia had one of the greatest medical schools in the nation, and of course does today.
Do you think that was at all related to or inspired by the passing of his wife in regard to the medical advancement?
Well, he suffered a tremendous amount of grief and loss. He'd had 6 white children, and 5 of those had died, by the time that he was designing the University of Virginia, and he'd lost his wife towards the end of the Revolutionary War. So undoubtedly that must have made an impact on him. But what is impressive is he argued that doctors should only act and intervene if they have tried and tested methods. And he felt much of the medical profession of his day was just quackery, and that what they were doing was actually in many ways endangering their patients, which I think most people would now agree with. The very first medical journal was called The Lancet, and that was the mentality of the time. Lancet, or and certainly drain the patient of blood. And he was appalled by those methods. He wanted only good science as the guide as to how you treat patients. And in terms of public education generally, I like your comment that he believed government to be responsible. We generally think of Jefferson as someone who wanted to limit government and was hostile to government. But this was one area where he felt government could play a major role. Now, it has to be said, he was thinking largely in terms of state government.
Yes.
And in fact, he was wanting to empower the constituencies within the state so that local people could control their own schools, because he recognized, as the population grows, people will feel less and less connected and less empowered to take control of their education system. This is still, of course, a major issue in the country, but he recognized you always have to build support for education. Now, the university, the governing board, were selected by the governor, and they still are, because he did recognize ultimately a public university needs to be answerable to the state. He was somewhat idealistic in that he thought the best and brightest people would be appointed governors, people who in some ways were smarter than the professors. He was worried there weren't enough sufficiently impressive people in Virginia to be members of the board. James Madison was a fellow board member and succeeded him as president of the board.
Well, I would like to thank you for speaking with me today. I have learned so much, and I did have a question for you just to finish up before we go. And that is, do you have any messages that you would send to parents of school-aged children about teaching them history and teaching them to look at history through maybe a lens, like a critical lens, to learn things about themselves and about how history repeats itself?
Yes, I mean, people get very worried that the historical facts are being lost, or that maybe schools and other institutions aren't teaching the facts and are more interested in making political messages. What I would say is the way we advance in history is by looking at lots of different perspectives, both winners and losers. The review to my Men Who Lost America that most thrilled me was by a local newspaper. And the person who wrote it had a lot of time in special ops, one of the most dangerous areas of service during the Vietnam War, and was clearly war-scarred. And at the end of his review, he said we should do this for all of America's wars, write about the enemy in a way that looks at it from their perspective. And I thought it was magnificent that someone who clearly had suffered and had risked his life for the country could think that way. And we need to do that with everything. Jefferson would say, check the facts, check the evidence. If you see a Jefferson quote or any other founder, you can check it immediately because all their papers are online. And if you just Google the quote, you can find out very quickly if it's authentic or not. Monticello has a service where it's got lists of false Jefferson quotes that it corrects, because these do go round. So check the evidence and use your reason. And we're never totally going to agree on the past because we come from different angles. Some people have been victims and will have a very different view of the way history is played out than those who have essentially benefited from the outcome.
That's sage advice, and I much appreciate it. And I will definitely use that when I'm explaining to parents about historical facts and how you have to do your own investigation, as I call my kids detective often, and we look into details.
Well, my hope is we can have a nuanced history that's neither totally negative nor totally positive. We can see the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yes.
That's what it should be about, while we can still celebrate the country that has emerged.
Yes, and it's a great way to learn about current times as well when you look into history, because you see parallels of how things played out. And I would just genuinely like to say thank you so much for speaking with me today on the Emily Rassam Show. And I will be putting links, would you prefer, from Amazon down in the description of your video, so that if you're interested, you can check out all of Andrew's books and maybe purchase a copy or two. And thank you so much. I hope that you have a great evening and much appreciate you joining me. Thanks for joining me today on the Emily Rassam Show. If you laughed, learned something, or at least didn't roll your eyes too hard, go ahead and like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, keep the coffee strong, your kids alive, and the dreams big.